Running a small co-working space means wearing too many hats all the time. Community builder, marketer, bricklayer, chef, therapist, all at once. It's exhausting. That's why we started the Community Builder cohort. It's where people who run small spaces can stop spinning their wheels and start making real progress. One member slashed their admin hours with one simple workflow shift. Another launched a newsletter they've been putting off for months and months. Yet another hosted a Sunday market that reignited their local community. If you're tired of fighting it out alone, check the Community Builder cohort link in the show notes or contact Emily or me directly. So excited. Hello folks, it's another Co-working Values podcast and I'm over the moon because it's been about 100 years since we've had this man in our luxury studio. Kofi, what are you known for and what would you like to be known for?
I'm known for creating Urban MBA. Urban MBA provides business and enterprise training to marginalized communities. So I believe in particular with all the coming changes in terms of the world of work, the UK, and how we even go about getting marginalized communities to ensure they are managing to play in this new economy and to consider all the things that are going to happen with the changing economy from the likes of technology. We don't want to continuously have the same things that have been happening for the last 20, 30 years happening again when we're in the fourth industrial revolution. So with all the job changes that are going to happen because of technology, it's really important that everybody has a side hustle. So at Urban MBA, we give 6 weeks, 12 weeks, and 1 year enterprise courses ranging from level 3 up to level 6. And what we want to do is, in particular, change the way that education is given and make sure all communities have access to higher education. Because at the moment, if you try to get into a university to do an MBA, it would cost you an arm and a leg, and many of my community cannot afford to do that. So that's what Urban MBA does, and we talk in particular about technology, and we have an EdTech hub in Old Street where we deliver this training.
That's good. That's the first time I've heard you explain it like that for ages. So Kofi and I met at Mainyard Studios in 2019, and I didn't even know what AI was. And before, what year did ChatGPT come out? Was it 22?
That was 2020, I believe, just around the pandemic, after the pandemic period.
He was like banging on forever about AI, and then suddenly here we are. So actually, I wouldn't even know what to do unless I'd sort of sat in those Urban MBA classes. So how did you, because you make that sound very easy, like, oh, we got an EdTech hub and we do these courses and stuff like that. But let's go back to the origin story. Where were you? What were you doing when you were like 17, Kofi?
Okay, so I grew up in East London, in particular in Hackney. That's where we first were. My parents and my mum used to work for Matchbox at the bottom of Hackney by Hackney Marshes, which was a real big part of my life. So I went to
Matchbox
Hamilton House.
cars?
Sorry?
The little Matchbox cars?
Yes. My mum used to work in that Matchbox factory at the bottom of Hackney by Hackney Marshes. And there was a notorious estate called Kingsmead Estate that was opposite it. And I could have got into a lot of trouble. But what happened is my parents moved to Forest Gate. And so for that reason, I didn't end up hanging around with so many of the bad boys. And I think that's what ended up saving me in a way. But around 17, I've got first-generation African Ghanaian parents, and most people who come from that culture or from marginalized communities, they really want their kids to do well. And in their eyes, it is always education, i.e. this higher education that I was talking about, and that's not the route I wanted to take. What ended up happening was a lot of friction between me and my dad, so everything I was doing was being scrutinized. One story that I don't mention to you a lot, Bernie, and you've never heard maybe this part of it, is that my dad in particular wasn't giving me any money to get to my exams, and so I only went to about 4 or 5 of my exams that I could go to because I had to walk from Forest Gate all the way to Homerton to then go and do my exams. So many of them I didn't turn up at. It was a long journey. So I could have got better results, but I didn't because at that time we were warring. I then went on to actually go and get a job in terms of being a newspaper boy, because my dad wasn't giving me any money. And one day I turned up at after I'd done my paper round, I turned up at 7 o'clock to get back into the house, and my dad was standing behind the door. I said to him, "What are you doing here?" And he's like, "Well, what are you doing? Where did you go?" And I'm like, "I got a job because you won't give me any money." There and then, he's told me that if I continued to work, I wouldn't be able to live in the house. And he expected me to go on and do some studying, even though he wasn't giving me any money. I think that broke the camel's back, because most parents, if your son had gone out and gone and got a job, you'd praise him, but not in
Yeah.
my case with my dad. So that completely killed our relationship. And I then decided I was going to a concert a bit later, and he said, "You can't go to this concert," which was the Big Daddy Kane Salt and Pepper.
Yeah, I was trying to think of who it was. Remember?
And so I came back, and what he'd done was he'd locked me out the house. So I went and slept in the local park bench, which was over Plaistow Station. Anybody who knows that area, it's no longer there. I got home the next morning because I knew my brother would be up around 7 a.m. He would let me in. But as I got there, I realized outside the front door were 2 black bin liners, and that was all my clothes that my dad had packed up for me. So there I was kicked out of house and home. And that's where all my challenges and inspiration started.
That was whenever you tell that story, I know that area. I used to live in Plaistow in Denby Road, so like I'm always like taken back to that and walking from. I used to bike from that area to Hackney, so like I can, and that was hard enough, let alone walking as a school kid. So what? So when you're standing there, and did you know what was going on? Did you have this like voice from above say, "Kofi, this is your moment," or did you just cry?
So many things sort of happened at that particular moment that ended up being part of the Urban MBA course. So in particular with neuroscience, it's the first part of what we do in the course. Nobody does any business unless they really get a grip on their brain and understanding how to set goals, etc. One of the things I remember the most was when I walked down the road from my mum's house with both bin liners on my back, is the feeling and the understanding that I was never, ever going to let him win or go back and think he'd won. And that, as an anchor in my head, has meant even these days, if I go back home, I always feel like I'm not welcome. Now, I didn't realize how powerful the emotion was at that particular time walking down, and I've got to admit I was crying, didn't know what I was going to do, etc. And so it's very interesting that when I started learning later on in what became part of neuroscience in the Urban MBA course, I remember all these things like the anchors and things that came back to me, and how powerful setting a goal is. Because when I set that goal in an emotional state, no matter what I do, I still feel unwelcome there, because it's like it's embedded in my body. So that happened. I slept in my friend's car for 3 nights. I then got into a bit of trouble with the police because I was starving. And my Irish gypsy friend, who was letting me use his Rover 2000 from the Sweeney, whatever it was at the time.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you what car it was, because it's so important. It's Juliet Bravo and the Sweeney.
Yeah. For anybody that can remember, but it was interesting. He was at least doing something to help me, and he woke me up on a Sunday morning and said, "We've got to get you some money," because I hadn't eaten for 3 days. So we ended up jumping on the local school roof, ironically on the same road as my parents' house. And we were on there on a Sunday morning at, I think it was about 8:30. It was that day and that moment that told me that I would never be a good criminal, because we were up there for only 5 or 10 minutes, and my gypsy friend Peter explained that we were going to rip the lead off the side of the school roof and go and sell it so we can make some money. And so during that, we were up there for 5 minutes, and then he just screamed "run" from the top of his lungs. He was on the opposite side of the roof of the school. And I was like, where are we going to run to? We're on top of the roof. We got to the edge and there were lots of police around. And as I said, I recognized I could never be a criminal because most people do criminal activities at the dead of night. And we were there at 9 a.m. in the morning or something. So the world and his wife were watching me from the buildings that were above us. And obviously they'd called the police. And I felt completely stupid at the time. But sometimes when you're hungry and you've not eaten food, you just do silly things, don't you?
And what, as you're saying all that, something that gets said, thrown around like entrepreneurial circles is like, no one's coming to save you. And I think, does that make sense in that situation there? Because I think when you realise that no one's going to come in and bail you out, like for me, it's like another level of energy is kicked in, and thinking or mindset, or whatever you want to call it.
So, I mean, you're right. And that's why I alluded earlier on to that feeling and that anchor that I put down that I was never going to go back. I only knew that thing. And so whatever I was going to do needed to go forward, not backwards. So after the stint in the police station and being fed that day, which was the first time I'd been fed for ages, but on that same point, it was probably the most awful food that I'd eaten, but it didn't feel like it for that reason. I left the police station and I knew that I needed to change or do something. I went back to my roots in a sense because I played football, as I mentioned to you, and I mentioned Hackney Marshes earlier on, played a prominent part in my life. Sunday league football was really important, but I still wanted to look cool. And so for my boots, I wanted a JD Sports string bag, which was all the rage at that time, to put your stuff in. They had multiple colors, but we only had one JD Sports there, and they had 20 in the country at the time. And the first one that they opened up was in the plaza. So I went in there to get a string bag. And at the same time, I started reading all the tags of the shoes. And you'll remember those days, there was Olympus Sports, which was the biggest sports shop at that time. Yeah. So I used to go into all of them. If you go down to Oxford Street, you have to make a day of it, especially at that time. So I couldn't just go to JD, get a string bag. I bought down all of the sports shops, Cobra, there was Champion, there was Olympus. And each time I went in there, I was reading the tags of the shoes and learning about them. I eventually went back to JD Plaza and asked for a job, and I aced the interview, and he pulled out a Nike shoe called the Air Stab, and I'd been reading all about it because it was a unique shoe that stopped pronation for heavy runners, and to have that sort of technical knowledge gave him the manager at the time. He was like, "You shouldn't know this stuff," and I said, "But I do. That just shows how dedicated I am." But he said, "You've got the job," but never called me. And I kept coming back every single week. And it took on the 7th occasion when I got back into the store, I was like, no matter what happened, I am going to get this job. So as I walked in, him and the assistant manager had boxes in their hand. And I was like, my brain was on autopilot at the time. So I was like, what are you doing? What's going on? And can I have my job? And he's like, we're moving across to the street because we've got our own space now. We're no longer going to be in the plaza. And I offered to give him a hand with the boxes. And that's how I finally got my job. So I suppose that when people listen to the story now, I was showing resilience. I was just desperate. So you can look at resilience all you want. I just knew that I needed to do something. And at the same time, maybe a week or two earlier, one of the people on my mum's road, the Partridge family, I've never mentioned their names before, but the Partridge family, he owned a church which had a hostel in it, and he'd seen pity on me because I knew his daughter Suzanne, and he called me over one time and said, Kofi, I know you're homeless, come and see me. And that's how I got a little 1-bedroom place in the hostel. So lots of people sort of rallied round and helped me, even though I didn't really know them. And I think that's what's also made me do Urban MBA, because that sort of, those acts of kindness, people that let me sleep on their floor and all of that, I will always remember as a very, very major point. And is why we want to do the same in terms of helping people to move on.
So then you were at JJB for like 10 years?
JD,
sorry.
Yeah, JJB was another one, but JD Sports for 10 years, yeah. I did all the managerial roles and got to the sort of the top thing that I wanted to do. But then the next thing was I was a big Nike aficionado, and I used to do a lot of training at JD Sports. And when Nike Town was opening, they then invited me to have an interview, and I got the job as the football manager there. It was all the rage because obviously Nike was the biggest thing since sliced bread. We've had all the Jordan stuff going on, and they was just super cool. And Nike Town was such a big deal when we opened at the time. They placed all the managers, me being one of them, on the Evening Standard magazine cover and all of these things. And I was in that role, I can't remember now, for about 18 months, and then I got promoted to the footwear manager, which was sort of the job that I wanted because I'm a big sneakerhead. And my life just changed from that. I grew with confidence, a lot of those things. But at the same time, at the back of my head, I knew that I hadn't learned anything at school. Most of it, my learning came from reading. I would categorize these 5 books in sort of order. So I read the Think and Grow Rich, then the Celestine Prophecy, and one was a story about how you should get money in your life. The other one was a spiritual story about energy. And the two of them combined started helping me to develop my mindset. I then read all the Rich Dad Poor Dad books, etc. And I was knowledgeable, but all the knowledge I had was the amount of time that I spent reading. And I got a love for reading because I used to not get along with my parents, and I used to always, in my little box room, read till about 3 a.m. in the morning. So all of that shaped me, and I was like, okay, I've got to do something about the world that we live in. And if somebody had taught me all this stuff at school, I would be a lot further than where I am. So I started writing the Urban MBA course in 2002 when I was at Nike. And it has now become what we see here in terms of what we're talking about. But all of those books, and one book in particular from an Australian entrepreneur called Jamie McIntyre, and that book was called What I Should Have Learned in School But Never Did. And that was the most transformative book out of all of them. It talked about the Fed Reserves, how they got the money. It talked about Nixon removing the gold standard. And all of this stuff was all about money and how the 5% of the world own 95% of the world's wealth. And it really changed my thinking that there's a massive inequality. And so with all of that sort of stuff is why I started writing Urban MBA, because I also recognize that every time there's changes in technology in particular is when a new era flourishes. And that's the same with what happened with Nike. There was a change in legislation. Athletics became professional, and all of these guys were starting to then get deals. Nike then could promote the product, but that stimulated that particular industry, and that's why we had that massive boom with all these different countries like Reebok, etc. Companies like Reebok, Fila, and all of that. Soon as the money went out of that sector, and the money went out of that sector because technology was no longer driving it, that's when you noticed the flatness of what happened. And in the end, that impacted on all the retail stores. So now there are only 3 or 4 in the UK compared to when me and you were growing up. There were over 40 different stores. Now that made up a big chunk of what we do with Urban MBA when we're teaching in terms of business, because we're teaching them to also look at these cycles and work out that this is when money is going to change. Now you're going to get 3 or 4 of them in your lifetime. And listening to Gary on that podcast with people like Daniel Priestley, when we take this down to the level of marginalized communities, you have to make it tangible for them to understand. So I can give them examples of, as an example, Lord Sugar. He was in the computer industry around the period of Amstrad. And that's when he made his money, because he sold Amstrad. So every time a new sector opens up, like the internet happened, it killed the music sector. It killed bookshops. It even killed high street recruitment. Recruitment firms then ended up going onto LinkedIn. So that changed. And then all these different areas were shut down and new ones opened. If we can teach marginalized communities how to understand these changes, they have a much better chance of delivering in a sector. And right now, all that money is in trillions and trillions, is in AI, tech, and these 9 transformative technologies. And we've never seen the likes of this change ever before. if you consider what the internet did to our lives, and we have now 9 that are going to completely transform it, these are the things that our community needs to understand, because they always want to do the same things from before. I see so many young people, I want to create a fashion brand. But if you're going to create a fashion brand now, you can't just create the same normal one. You have to think of the technology that is going to change and enhance fashion and do something new. But because they're so far away from that market, they all want to do the same thing historically. And I want to just use like a grime artist to give you an example. Central C, well, he's a hip hop. Before I get it wrong, he's hip hop, not grime, and that's what he'd cuss me for. Central C has become a great artist, and what he's gone and done is create a clothing brand again, right? But what people don't realize is that the music thing that he's doing is what's driving that brand. Does that brand have enough to last for the next 5 or 10 years? I would probably say no, because it has no technological impact. And sooner or later, the product's going to change to enhance us in the same way your phone can now enhance every aspect of your life. So your phone can measure all these things like your blood heart rate and all of that stuff. Can you imagine when me and you were growing up with phones, Bernie? It didn't even have texts on them, right? And now it can regulate your whole life.
I remember like just the phone on the wall and taking it into the cupboard under the stairs to talk. Yep. One of the things like is always in my head, because I was listening to Gary Stevenson, Daniel Priestley, and Stephen Bartlett talking, and as I was listening to it, they were like Daniel was arguing like everyone could be an entrepreneur, and Gary is from our side of town, East London, saying this is the reality of growing up. And I think Gary's growing up is nearer like what we would have experienced. And Stephen grew up in, was it Moss Side, and has become this. But there's this, it annoys me when I hear it like, oh, you can start a business doing what you love with the internet and a laptop. And we both know people that have done that, but we both know loads of people that haven't been anywhere near that. And like when people turn up to Urban MBA, I never get the feeling that it's like, yeah, kids, you can do it all. There's a whole like load of shit you have to do before you can flick a switch on your laptop and be an internet millionaire. And like, how do you, when you hear all that, anyone could do this, there's and I get this from Lorena as well, where, my wife has worked with so many underserved communities in different countries, and there's you just can't like wake up one day and be an entrepreneur.
So their discussion was very interesting, because first and foremost, and if we look at 3 points, Bernie, first point is that one, actually everybody needs to become an entrepreneur because of what's about to happen in this 4th industrial revolution. So whether you can or not, you're going to have to. So
would that be your thing? Because that is a very different message between like, oh yeah, kids, anyone can do it. It's like, mate, you just we're so screwed. You need to find a way to get your shit together.
Absolutely, 100%. That is exactly how it is. Right, we are moving into, and when you look at I think maybe what wasn't looked at enough is the economic circumstances. So Gary had a point with the economy is always going down and all these things that he talked about. But the economic circumstances with these new technologies, as we go forward, everything that's been predicted is a world of just rich and poor. So the middle class are going to drop out, and you're going to sit in one camp or the other. That is because of these new technologies coming in. You then look, there's been tests about 4-day work weeks, Bernie, right? And they're not doing that just because it's great for your health. Remember, England has always had the economy where they've done more hours per week than any other country. And Germany, probably the only other people that have people that are doing 38 to 40 hours a week. It doesn't happen in the rest of Europe, etc. So you can't go from that all of a sudden to why are they, or you should be questioning, why are they now all talking about 4-day work weeks? We're going to have much more time on our hands because of the fact that all these technologies are going to change everything that we do. And that's why they're looking at 4-day work weeks, in my opinion, more than anywhere else. On top of that, they have been testing the universal basic income for 2 years. right, in this country. And there is a whole report from a company called Autonomy that you can get online where they're asking people to give an opinion. But they've already selected families in Central Jarrow, middle of England, and in East Finchley, where they're giving them £1,600 a month as a test and doing that report to then feed back to the government. So all of those things should tell you that there's rapid changes about to happen in the economy. And if you look at everything from the World Economic Forum to councils and all that, they've got a plan from 2025 to 2030. Why? Because in this 5-year period, these technologies that are going to come in are so revolutionary that they are going to transform everything that we did. So when you've got to look is that you've got to look at, for me, those are the underlying factors as to why we have to do that. And it's great that Gary and Daniel talked, but I don't think they mentioned enough why.
I thought that was a very, mainstream conversation. And the other thing, as I've I'm in Gary's Discord, and I just looked at all the, followed Daniel on LinkedIn, and I've seen the comments after that. And I think, basically, I listen to in-person people like you, and I read books and stuff. And I would, if someone said to me, "Oh, what do you know about this?" I'd say, "I'm very curious, enthusiastic." I'd never say, "Oh, well, I know, here's what we should do," because I absolutely don't know what we should do.
Mm-hmm.
But people under there, I'm sort of setting that up, because a lot of the comments could have been made in 2021. I'm COVID. When COVID happened, I was shocked at how many people did not know you could do a Zoom call on your phone, or you could do a video call, or it is unbelievable how, because we just hoover this stuff up every day. It's unbelievable how many people. A good example, because this is a co-working podcast, the amount of co-working space managers and owners who use ChatGTP to write an email, and there's all this other stuff which we won't get into, but you can do your whole business strategy there and everything. And it is scary how much people don't realize.
Yeah, completely. And we had 56 changes in the globe last year in terms of new people running the countries, etc. It's a massive time of change. All of these things are happening underneath. And even for me, with marginalized communities, you have to give them the reason why they have to do what they do. Now, it's very well known that in particular, the Black communities are the biggest spenders, right? And these are the things that need to be sort of talked about when we're
I don't think it is well known.
Maybe not.
Could you explain that data point a bit?
Okay, so I just want to, let's take it back to what happened with Rodney King all those years back. 30, 40 years ago, Rodney King was beaten up in LA, and that became big news. I loved all that stuff to do with the songs that came out from NWA, which I won't bring up.
Ice Cube, Who's Got the Panasonic?
And all of those tunes. And yes, let's not talk about The Police. It was one of those songs that came out. And I loved that. And it sort of gave us an anthem. And in a way, it allowed us to stand up and talk through hip hop about things like Rodney King. We then get all the way back to just after the George Floyd incident, right? And so what I see is 30 years later, the same things happened. And so it shows no change. The second aspect of that is that all of a sudden, all these companies started changing, but they didn't change because of the George Floyd incident, in my opinion. They changed because they knew that Black people would stop spending money with them because they were so outraged. The only time anything happens good for Black people is when we decide to withdraw our money, right? Now, these aspects were not also talked about in terms of Gary and Daniel. But if you look, they're dismantling the whole DEI process all across the globe now, led by Donald Trump, because really we didn't move anywhere. And the only time actually anybody does anything for marginalized communities is when they refuse to spend their money with them. But we are not savvy enough as a community to make that and strengthen that. And I tell you what, if they did that now, And I started a campaign that went global, that everybody said, we are not spending our money with these companies. I guarantee you DEI would be back by 9 a.m. tomorrow morning.
Yeah. I thought, because I've been, all the stuff we're talking about on this podcast is like been particularly playing around in my head. I've been watching Gary Economics since like last October, and one of the things is like Amazon, how they set it up. They're in Ireland or Luxembourg, so they turn over billions in the UK. But it comes down to just tell me what you think of this. It's like it seems like the government won't do anything because they give those tax breaks and stuff like that. So they kind of ignore it because it's convenient to ignore it. But then us as the general public are the consumers. Like we would rather, either because it's cheaper and we don't like to pay for things, or we like to get the best deal on things, or it's just more convenient. Or we would, if I'm going to buy a pair of headphones and I can get them on Amazon for £25, I will, instead of going to the local shop and paying 50. So I support the system that screws me over in the end.
Yeah.
And it
Yes.
seems like it goes to that John Alexander stuff. Like we're such good consumers, we're maintaining the status quo. But if we all withdrew our money at the same time, like Jeff Bezos would have to pay tax in the UK and Google would have to pay tax properly in the UK. And, I know I'm simplifying it here because, economics is very complicated.
Yeah, but simplifying is good. And that's the whole thing. The biggest thing that we need to remember, Bernie, and one of the things that I want to highlight as our failings is we did all the stuff to do with Black Pound Day and all of that type of stuff. Where is it now? Because I tell you what should be happening now is that campaign needs to start again. And we need to say we are only spending money with these people. What the system does, and it's based a lot on marketing, and they test the area and all of that. The outrage that was going on makes them understand at that particular time that there's enough energy around in people that they will actually drop their money. Now it's all calmed down. What's now happened is like they feel they're in control again, and the media is controlling all of that, and people are just spending because there's no outrage. What we've got to do is have a collective understanding that, and this is just generally stuff in the globe, Bernie, is that we are 90% of the globe. When we put a stand down, and when we're talking about that bigger subject, the 5% cannot win. The whole thing about this is divide and conquer. So our community now does not have a Black Pound Day that's now looking at DEI from Donald Trump's position and starting a whole campaign again in America saying, okay, fine, if you're going to dismantle that, we will not buy from you. And I guarantee you it will change. Nothing ever happens unless it's related to money.
Yeah,
right?
It's really sad, but that is like the reality of the situation.
It's the biggest. I'll throw one other really controversial point into this, Bernie, and that unless, as a Black community, and let's just talk about Black community because that's where I'm from, and we're talking about entrepreneurship in this area, unless we recognize that if we don't create services for ourselves, it will never, ever, ever happen in terms of parity. I am 100% sure of that, Bernie. And I would stake everything on this, is that is the reason we cannot. For all this time, VC and angel funding. So if we kick it up a notch to those areas that Gary and maybe Daniel live in. Daniel we'll call Gary what we were discussing off this, that he's a grime boy from Essex, right? No problem. Right?
The London Borough of Redbridge.
London Borough of Redbridge, right? But Daniel, on the other hand, has access to all those people who are VC and angel funded, right? He's got a community around him, and he's got that white privilege that if he goes to ask for money with a great idea, people will give him money. We cannot access finance, and it's been said all the time that those communities that cannot access finance will never grow. And part of the problem of being an entrepreneurship and why, in Gary's eyes, not everybody can be an entrepreneur, relates back to, as we were talking about only 5 minutes ago, money. Can you get money to fund your business? And the answer for Black communities and in marginalized communities is no. So ultimately, your business will fail. And ultimately, there's a report from the Sutton Trust that shows this, that when actually the Labour government gave a lot of money to social entrepreneurs, they thrived the best. And this was around the late 90s, 2000. And that report came out that when they looked at these social enterprises and charities, they had been there the longest because they were given money. So if you cannot get money to fund your business, you cannot survive.
Can you say, have you got because it's not the first time we talked about this on this podcast, like the figure, it's like 1% of VC funding is given to people of color and marginalized communities.
It's 0.1, 0.2. But then the other reason is that these things are intricately linked. And why I say that if we don't deal with it in our community or sort it out ourselves, we will never get any further. So the reason why I say these things are linked is because if we then look back at you not being able to access finance and funding, it then makes the whole game of what you're doing really difficult. And so then your resilience factor needs to be beyond reproach. And that's why I have, right? Because if I told you all the whole things that go on with us trying to get funding, and you've seen it because you're a trustee of our organization, I have never had anybody come to Urban MBA from outside to see what we do who hasn't gone, this is impressive. Honestly, Bernie, right? So we can say 99.9% of people come here and they go, that's amazing what you are doing, right? Fine. Where do we get the funding from? We're also looking ahead. And so one of the things is that if we look at our community, and I'm saying that we can't access, we're looking ahead to say, when we're early enough in the system, we can change it. And so I don't fit into all the criteria for funding because it deals with issues that are now. I'm trying to deal with not making the issue worse and make sure we're prepared for the future, which is why we can never get out of this rut, because in the education system, it doesn't talk like that. So not only do you not have an understanding of what's going on, all the money is in tech that the educational system is not teaching, right? If you look now, people who are, there is a recent survey that came out, or I was talking to a tech entrepreneur, and he's saying that UK's tech entrepreneur scene, what happens is they set up companies here and then they bugger off to Silicon Valley because they can't get funding here, right? So Keir Starmer comes out and says, we're going to be the powerhouse of AI. Well, not really, because there's no funding around for that, because these companies that are starting are going to Silicon Valley to get money.
Because when he said that, you sent me a link about that,
Yeah.
And I sent it to people I know, like, red hot on AI and for companies, and said, oh, this sounds really good. And all of them sent back saying, like, there's no money here. Like, that is such hot air. And it's really sad because probably Keir he thinks that's a great idea, but he doesn't understand the reality of where people in that business will go, because you have to have, just sitting in co-working spaces for so long, you can say something's going to happen, but you can say we're going to make the AI ecosystem in Grays, but because there's no one in Grays in Essex talking about AI, everyone's still going to be hanging around Canary Wharf and London. It's
absolutely. And we talked in education-wise, and we even talked about your sister in terms of the schooling system that she has as an example. So if you're not getting this information pointing you, so I would argue right now, Bernie, that if you're in the schooling system, you must have a whole thing dedicated to technology, and not in the way it is, because they dilly dabble with saying to people, oh yeah, you can code and you do a bit of science project. It's all rubbish. None of that is preparing any of them for the future of what's really happening. Because for all the AI that we just mentioned, that Keir Starmer mentioned, what countries are challenging the Americans with AI? It isn't bloody the UK, is it? DeepSeek has just come out in China, right? And then we've got this new AI that I mentioned to you the other day called Mana or Manus, I can't remember what it's called, which is the first AGI. So when we're talking about that,
what is AGI? Just so
yes, AGI stands for Artificial General Intelligence, and this is when AI can then run a whole company by itself. So it means it's closer to being sentient. It's making decisions, can take over your laptop, and do things for you. And the first one that we've had proper, Claude is close to it, but the first one proper is Mana from China. So we have the usual suspects, and what a great film that is. But that goes towards this particular area, that it's America and China who have put money into that area that it's showing that they're coming out of. So why isn't it coming out of Africa? We know why, because they're a third world nation, countries in particular, that are trying to catch up and don't have access to finance, right? But the UK have no excuse. The UK, it's because the system that they use in the UK isn't as robust as America and does not help even those people to develop in that way. Having said that, quantum, which is actually the biggest technology that's ever going to come out, there is a lot of companies in the UK that seem to be involved in quantum. To get money from this area, Bernie, you can get it from the UKRI as an example, but they are very, very specific in what they do and who they hand this money out to. In terms of VC and angel funding, we have the same problems, that there isn't as much in this area. And then we bring that down to, and again, I'll say black, not marginalized. We'll then bring that down to black communities. They don't even understand what tech is going on and cannot access finance as well, which give us a disadvantage of probably 95% against us to become entrepreneurs. And that's why Gary would say what he said, that not everybody can do that. It so happened for him that LSE thing gave him access to all of the banking cartel, so he knows the system, and that's why he is out of it and can talk in the way that he talks about it. But he also understands the difficulty in getting money when you're from a marginalized community.
There's a lot in that. This just popped in my head, sorry, but when I was at university, 2,000 years ago, and I worked in a school in Poplar, and then I worked in a restaurant in the city, which was a great deal. The tips are amazing. And I would leave that school in Poplar and cycle up the Mile End Road. And even then, the head teacher used to say, this is nuts, because we're here, and across the road there's Canary Wharf, and there's the great, I don't know if it's still the case today, but the greatest economic divide in the UK at that time was Tower Hamlets, because there were millionaires who worked in the city buying flats in Canary Wharf, and then there was all those, Chris Street Market area and stuff like that. And I would cycle up that road, and I'd go into the city, and people were drinking champagne and making deals and all this kind of stuff. And I just couldn't get my head around how those kids could live so near that, and, the wealth inequality that was there. And then there was over the years, I just met lots of projects where, trying to get young people to go from Hackney and get mentored by people in the city and stuff like that. And you did the stuff with Caleb, where Urban MBA went to 22 Bishopsgate, and things happen, but it's nuts how the wealth inequality in that small 5 mile gap.
And so, Bernie, when we then look at this stuff, and you want to sort of say, okay, well, let's not bring up the problems, because I've talked about the problems. What are the solutions? They do those swap families, right? Those swap families that they do, and it's always like you watching it, and it'll be on. Well, I haven't watched any TV for years, but it'll be on Channel 4, BBC, and it's like a really ghetto class family, but they've swapped each other, and it's a lot of fun to watch, right? Or is it? Right? Now, if we're going to do a real swap family, let's take a young black child between the ages of 0 to 7, and let's place him in a financial banking family for 20 years. And let's see where he comes. Because at the end of the day, if we're going to be teaching somebody later on to go into banking and finance, but you're getting them at 16 and 17, what really has happened is that a lot of their mindset has been made with what they've seen on the streets and the people that they hang around with. So to turn them around is a lot harder to do. Interestingly enough, and I mentioned finance on purpose with Gary, because you've heard of the Forbes family, the black family, that, where was he also? Finance. right? The whole system revolves around this finance issue that we do not talk about or put enough pressure on. And that's where the problem fails. The reason that they won't talk about it is because it only helps those banking people at the top. So you've got a man like, what's his name, the ex-PM. His whole family is banking.
Cameron.
No, the other one.
The other one. Rishi.
His whole
Sunak.
family, yeah, Rishi Sunak. His whole family is finance. They've got hundreds of millions. His wife is finance, right? How many of these marginalized community kids learn enough about finance or get into that area, which is why we cannot open up our own angel investors, etc. And then the people who are up there at the moment, we've been so divided and conquered by media that they cannot get together to be able to do that and to change the system, which is why we are in a perpetual cycle of not being able to get anywhere. Am I making sense?
Yeah. One of the things that is, I think the message is wrong. Like as I watch more and more stuff, there's this message of like tax the rich, and that dilutes what is actually we need to be paying attention to, because there's wealth inequality in the country and all the stuff we just talked about here, and that means that the message is anyone who's a bit rich is going to get taxed, and anyone who's not is going to get left behind. But it's way more complicated than that.
Yeah, completely agree. And this is why I'm saying the games are being played. The games are being played because those areas that we have to deal with in terms of finance or given these opportunities are not there. And like I said, it's twofold. One, we need to do better, and we need to get the people like the Forbes family, Gary, all those people that care to actually set up something in a way that will allow us to access finance easier. When I talk about Suni Rishi and his wife and all that, you can do anything you want, Bernie, when you've got money. And that's where the power lands, right? So people know that it's that. So without access to that, it's virtually impossible for us to ever get out of this system. But also, we've got to stop being not trusting our community in terms of all of those types of things, in terms of what we're doing, and find a way to come together to create our own services. And that is another thing that is sadly lacking.
Well, there's a couple of things that, like, I'm going to link to a video by Brian Eno, the artist and musician, and he says, he's asked like, why do you support the tax the rich thing? And he's in the same thing as Gary, which is the Patriot. I can't remember the name of it, Patriotic Millionaires or something.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, someone says, "Oh, why do you think people like you should be taxed, Brian?" And he goes, "Because I want to live in a safe, fair society." And that made me think of like other countries I know where if you're rich, you have to go around with a bodyguard. And maybe we're, closer to that in the UK than we think. And so he wants to live. Part of his reason is like fairness, and part of it is like, I want to live in a safe society. And there was another point about that. Do you want to respond to that, and I'll remember what I was talking about?
Well, I mean, living in a safe society does not mean taxing the rich, right? Because there is also a section in Urban MBA where we talk about how money works in terms of when it comes from us as a consumer. And it really just goes to about 10 companies, Bernie, right? So all money, in the end, funnels into about 10 to 20 companies across the globe. And so whatever money is distributed ends up back at them, like you mentioned, Amazon, you mentioned Google. All of these companies, all money in the end relates back to them. So they will always have the power, because any money that's given to us goes back to all of these huge corporates. The system isn't working when you look at it that way, because it's always top heavy, right? It's impossible for us to change from that if only 10 companies are receiving the majority of the money, even though it says SMEs are the lifeblood of each country, because there's more of them than the big corporates. But ultimately, all money goes back to
Yeah,
those areas.
So there's three things here. I've got to ugly slide this in. Brian Eno's main point is the one I said about living in a safe society, but his bigger point is that people. I'm going to link to this little video in the show notes. Is being when you're rich, like he says, when I'm rich, I just I make money and then I have money and then I make some more money, because I can, in his case, I can book a recording studio and do all this stuff.
Yeah.
But also being poor is really, really expensive.
Yeah.
So, I can, I don't know, Google Workspace. I can either pay whatever it is, like £20 a month, or I can pay like half of that by signing. Grammarly is a great example. £25 a month to pay monthly, or £120 to pay the whole year. So you always which is a great business model for them. There's an incentive there, but also if you can only pay, if your cash flow is only allowing you to do that, you're in that situation.
Yeah.
And that SME thing, micro small businesses are the backbone of the UK, and they always get ignored. And when you're one of those small businesses, like in Islington, we know the affordable workplace scheme there. One of their inclusion things is that when £1 is spent in Islington, and I think this is any borough, £1 is spent in Islington with a local business, it goes around 4 times. And when it's spent, with Sainsbury's or Marks and Spencer's, it just goes into one of those big companies you referred to later.
Yeah.
Earlier, sorry.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose that's why we call ourselves the University for Street Entrepreneurs, because we want to make this stuff at street level. It needs to be, and we've got to make them understand what type of what's going on in the ecosystem, whether it's finance or not. They're not getting taught that at school. Ridiculously, yesterday, Bernie, I had a guy whose daughter is 7 or 8 years old, and she came here and she interviewed me about technology because he loves what we do. And interestingly enough, when I'm talking to her, she randomly just comes out with this point: school's really rubbish, it doesn't teach me anything. It's remarkable now how many young people, especially in the Gen Alpha category and below, are very clear that school is not teaching them what they need to be taught. And so for us communities and having a world of rich and poor, what that world will really mean is that those people who understand finance will be in the rich side. Those people who don't understand finance will be in the poor side. And for me, that is why it costs more money if you want to go to Oxford or Cambridge, because they do teach you that in a lot more detail and you're around those people that do that, and why we can't access it. So they will pay for you to be dumb. So anything on level 1, 2, and 3, the government will pay for. Anything above that, where it goes to level 6, they won't pay for, because you have to fund that yourself. That is clearly a divide in itself, Bernie. Right? So if we're gonna look at the whole system, that should be something that we should all be going, well, how the hell does that work? Shouldn't the people who don't have money be supported to do level 6 and learn these things? Instead, you only want to teach them crap or something that isn't going to get them any further. And that's the quality of the system straight away.
But it's like generalizing. It's always been like that, because when I studied education at university, I thought school was like, when I turned up to university because I wanted to be a teacher, and I thought school was like, oh yeah, you go to school and you get a job. That's what I've been led to believe all my life. And then we had really helpful, radical, not wildly radical, but they were like eye-opening people who taught us. And there's a guy called Sir Robert Sunning, who started education in the UK in the 1880s. And people like Bernardo's and a lot of churches, and Methodist churches and Catholic churches had schooling before, because they thought it was good for people to get education, probably mainly because they wanted to make sure everyone became a good Christian and read the Bible. But this guy stood up and he realized that more and more people would get educated. And the reason for state education, and he said this in Parliament, he goes, we must educate our masters. And he basically made the point is if we don't get hold of education now, like other people will, and then we need to be telling these people what they need to know to keep them in line and make sure they're obedient and following the industrial revolution complex.
Absolutely. And these kids now they're becoming side hustlers, but they're doing side hustling on the street because they know they can't access these areas of funding and finance, and that's where the perpetual problem and why I mentioned about the safety aspect of what Daniel Priestley and taxes are. That's not going to be true. If we end up having much more people who are poor, crime will ultimately go up because they're going to fight, and not in the right sectors. They're going to fight dirty. It impacts themselves more than anywhere else, but they have a feeling that, well, even if we don't do it, we'll never come out of it, right? And so that's why I say, wouldn't it be great if Gary took one person and Daniel Priestley took one person and gave them that sort of access that they have and the knowledge that they have from two people in marginalized communities, and let's see what really happens. Can they teach them to do that? Because I tell you what, Gary would be teaching them trading and they would learn a lot from funding and all of that area in terms of how that would look. And Daniel would have the networks and stuff that would potentially give the others access to finance. That would be
And
a great.
And Steve would teach them how to start a podcast. What? So what? Just to wrap up here, what is? We're going to have to come back and do part 2 of this. But like, what do you want people to take away from this? Because I think what I want you to say is like, whoever we are, we need to find a way to build our own ecosystem. That's, I think, the strongest message.
What I want people to take away from this is the coming changes, Bernie. The coming changes are so important that they're just blinded by what's going on. These debates are sort of happening without telling you what's going on. You've gone to the World Economic Forum site, it will tell you there's going to be 400 million jobs shortage. 400 million jobs, right? In terms of these new areas coming through. We already know that nobody knows what jobs are going to be available for the next sector in terms of what, but we need to wake people up that they need to be entrepreneurship, and also that they need to have some form of semblance about funding and finance in terms of what they do. I would even say that to myself. I don't have enough of the right contacts around me that have access to those areas. Having said that, our mission is in a sector that nobody wants to do. I don't believe people want to solve this issue. And so a lot of it will have to be how resilient I am in order to get that about out there with maybe 95% of people against what we do. That's how it feels.
You know, it sounds very Gary. A lot of the things you say is like he's like, he says a lot. I don't think I'm going to win, but I'm going to try anyway. And also I was, you know, he says, you know, I studied at school and did this and got the job in Citibank and went to LSE and stuff like that. And he says, what I did is not replicable. And do you think what you did is replicable? Because there's a lot of personal agency in there and self-motivation, and, you know, and you make it sound very easy now, but that was over a period of years, like, you know, turning up to off the street, working the forest gate and stuff like that. Could someone else just go and do what you did?
What was the dividing factor for me is that I did have a corporate background. So I got to learn what it's like.
But when you were 17 in East Ham or Forest Gate, wherever it was, could you, from that starting point, so Gary was in Seven Kings in Ilford, and he got from getting kicked out of Ilford County High, doing his A-levels, studying hard, getting into LSE, playing the card game that went in his favour, because he always says he cheated, but Citibank rigged it to set him up to see if he could cope under pressure, and then he got his internship at Canary Wharf. And then it's a different journey, but you know, you turned up to JD Sports 7 times, carried the boxes across, stayed there for like 8 years or something, and then that got you onto the path where you are now. So like, when you tell that story, I kind of did a similar thing to get into good restaurants when I was starting out my illustrious catering career in the West End of London. But is your path replicable from the age of 17?
It's replicable if you are a resilient person. And resilience Can resilience be taught is another thing to do. Now, if you look at sport in terms of athletics and all that, resilience can be taught if you teach people how to really grasp and understand their mindset. I got that from books. And then why I mentioned to you I had a corporate background is then my learning came from those things with my resilience. So if that is replicated, where somebody has got resilience through whatever activity that is, and then gets some experience in terms of the job market at a bigger level, it's replicable because you'll learn, right? The problem is where that individual came from. So I could have got involved in gangs. I could have been saying, well, life has dealt me a really crappy thing. I will just do whatever I need to fight to get this. If I have to hit somebody, do whatever, I'll do that. But I chose straight away that was not my thing. And I knew that, as I said, because the one time I was on that roof, that was the wrong thing. But really, I was getting a lot of that information through sport. And that helped me to develop those resilience in terms of it. So unique circumstances that they might be, but we know what the model is now. And that's why we have it at Urban MBA. It's mindset. We have to get them to get their mindset correct, which isn't given to them at school. Then we have to give them some understanding of the economy and the world that they live in, because they don't get that at school. Then we have to show them what tech and what sectors are open, because they don't get that at school. If these things were replicated at school, could we get more people? And the answer categorically is yes. So the systems does not allow you to get through unless you have, to your point, unique stories like me and Gary, whereas the system can make it people get through if it was changed. But if you're doing something that is 100 years old in this period now, it will never, ever bring through people. And so those unique circumstances like me and Gary are the only things that allow it to win.
That is a great place to end. Where can we're going to put links in the show notes, but where's the best place to track you down online, Kofi? We
are on LinkedIn, Urban MBA on LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn. We're on all the social media sites, Urban MBA _ on Instagram, Twitter, and all the others you can find us on as well. Please go on there, donate, etc. If you and just have a look at some of the case studies that we've had, because we've got a remarkable amount of people into these areas that's doing well, but it takes long-term growth and long-term development that sadly governments are not prepared to do for these communities.
And folks, we're going to link to the fourth Industrial Revolution white paper?
Yes, Education in the Fourth Industrial Revolution white paper that we've written, that came out last year. Which you can read, or you can put it in Google Notebook LM and have a podcast made to you on the deep dive, which is a really good listen. And if you go to, we say every episode, we're very proud of our show notes. In the bottom there's a link to the LinkedIn group. There's a link to the event series we're doing, building up to European Co-working Day, where you come and join with other co-working space owners and operators and work out how to run an event. And even if you don't run an event in European Co-working Day, you will lots of juicy to and whatever. I'm not going to say that. Conversation with your peers about how to run events and get more people into your co-working space. And as always, wherever you are in the world, be careful out there. It is a jungle.